You are listening to the Enormocast.
Hey folks, the word Enormo has long been used by Enormocast listeners to get great coffee from Defiant Bean and now bonfirecoffee.com. But now the magic word is going to make you not only more alert, but stronger and therefore more attractive. How does this work? Is simply screaming it at the crux enough? Perhaps, but more indirectly, but effectively, you can now use Enormo to get a discount on pure climbing holds. Go to pureholds.com, PURHOLDS.com, and enter Enormo at checkout for 10% off your purchase. And while you're there, check out the Enormo hold.
We gotta get
Listen, where are you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
big
big
house. We
place,
sold
that
it out.
side of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,000 seats? We really should.
The hell are you doing?
I couldn't sleep. I'm checking the ropes. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out.
Good weather, bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, with support from Maxim Ropes.
And Defiant Bean is now Bonfire Coffee. How did that happen? Don't worry about it. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is Wednesday, September 17th, 2014, about 8:30 Mountain Standard Time, and this is episode 65 of the Enormocast. Episode 65, a conversation with Russ Clune. I had the pleasure of going on a trip with Russ a couple years ago. We went down to Colombia. For you longtime listeners, that's where I got the Cody Roth interview a while ago. But Russ and I got to know each other down there, and right away I enjoyed listening to his stories that go all the way back to the late 70s and into the 80s. And the 80s happen to be sort of my favorite climbing decade. You know, I know a lot of people like the Golden Age. A lot of people are into the Stone Masters from the 70s. But you know what? The 80s, that's where it all went down. That's where we decided how free climbing was really going to work. And kind of what we're doing now was developed in the 80s, for better or worse. Some people think it, went downhill. We started hangdogging, wearing Lycra, doing all sorts of weird shit. But truth is the folks that created basically the sport that most of us are doing today were working it out in the 80s. So anyway, that was Russ Clune. And I've become quite good friends with Russ. And it was really a pleasure to sit down and have him convey some of those stories to you guys. So that's coming up. And I don't have much else to say this time around. I'm headed out tomorrow morning to the Kragan Classic. By the time most of you guys hear this, I'm sure it will be gone past. I'm sure it will be an amazing time. And we'll be headed out there tomorrow, the long trip from Colorado to West Virginia. And I will be setting my Eastern climbing record. I will have not gone any further that longitudinal direction to rock climb in the United States, rather. I mean, I've crossed over to Europe. But, so it's going to be kind of cool. West Virginia, man. Never even been there. Have not been to that state at all. It's, I've got some stereotypes. I'm going to find out if they exist over there in West Virginia. I'm sorry. I do. That's just the way it is, I'm going there, though, with an open mind, knowledge, to gain knowledge about Southeast climbing. Is that even considered the Southeast? I don't know. See, I got to find these things out while I'm there. Anyway, going to do a live show. So if you do happen to hear this tomorrow or Friday sometime and you live close by, come on down. I don't know too much else about it. KraganClassic.com, AAC event. All right, on to a conversation with the man, Russ Clune. Now, Russ has been climbing a really long time, but he also has been climbing well a really long time, and he's seen a lot of different sort of movements and fads and things go down in climbing, especially in free climbing, and he talks a lot about that and climbing in Europe with such luminaries as Wolfgang Gulick, Kurt Albert, Jerry Moffitt, and Bern Arnold, and a bunch of other people, which for me, it was just an amazing thing to hear about. In addition, Russ made his living in climbing as well. He was one of the people who invested right off the bat in Black Diamond when it became Black Diamond. And hopefully we'll hear that story down the road here on the Enormocast of the demise of Chenard Equipment and the beginnings of Black Diamond, which, they're my sponsor, but also they're a mainstay in climbing equipment, one of the sort of longest lasting companies if you include the Chenard days in that. And anyway, bankruptcy, lawsuits, all sorts of things went down to turn the company into Black Diamond, and Russ was right there at the beginning. So climbing has not only fed him spiritually, but it has literally put food on his table for the longest time, although he's kind of retired from that now and just living the good life. So enjoy this, East Coast climbers. Yes, this one is for you in particular. I'm trying to help you out. Russ Clune telling stories from the 80s. Folks, as you know, Black Diamond is one of the major sponsors of the Enormocast, and while the money they've handed me has disappeared into the dark hole of debauchery, they also hand money over to some important organizations, like the American Alpine Club, like the Access Fund, and like the Nature Conservancy, the people who control a major part of Indian Creek. So when you're spending your money on new gear, consider the fact that not only do they make great gear, but they're also trying to protect the places that you're going to use it. Black Diamond, proud sponsor of the Enormocast. Anyway, cool. Well, we can just go ahead and get started.
Sure.
I'm sitting in Salt Lake City at the. This is another installment from the 2014 Outdoor Retailer Trade Show Enormocast Extravaganza, where I always stack up a few people and get some interviews. The last one of the weekend. Or what's coming up to be the weekend is with my good friend Russ Clune. Hey, Russ, how's it going?
Good, Chris. How are you doing today?
Good. This is cool because we've talked about doing this for a while. You know, I went on a trip with Russ to Colombia last year, or 2 years ago now? 2 years ago now.
Yep.
And I spent the whole trip like listening to stories, you know, drinking beers and listening to stories. And every time I was like, oh, man, I wish this was on the show. This was on the show. Some of which I don't think Russ will be willing to publicly repeat.
Definitely not.
But a lot of stuff was really cool. And anyway, but since then you've become sort of a fan of the show.
The show's great. I mean, there's a bunch of my heroes have been on the show, and you've done a good job of cataloging them. I think it's been fun.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of, I mean, you know, I want to get the new people up and coming, and I kind of want to get a historical record of all the people in between and guys that have been at it for, you know, forever, if I can. I mean, all the way up into, you know, some of the last guys that are from the golden age. I'd love to get some of those dudes on the show too, you know.
Well, this is the place to find them. They're trying to find work still.
Exactly. That's true. Although I haven't seen the bird at this show, have you?
No, and thank God.
Yeah.
He's had a couple of episodes here. He may not be welcome back to Salt Lake at all.
I can only imagine. But he was featured. I saw the premiere of Valley Uprising, the new Sender film that I think will be out to the public this fall.
Yeah.
And he featured prominently in there, of course.
As he should.
Yeah, as he should. Anyway, but this is awesome. So I'm really appreciative that, Russ, that you sat down with us here. I don't know. Let's get started by just kind of talking about your career that spanned how many years? How many years have you been climbing?
Since 77. So I started in the fall of 77. And, you know, at that time, in the 70s, climbing was something I always thought would be a really cool thing. I grew up in a family that had nothing to do with the outdoors. It was about playing golf and those kinds of country club, suburban New York.
Where were you?
Things.
Oh, okay, so you were up
in Westchester County, yeah.
Okay.
So there's nothing interesting, no interest in my family in the outdoors. I mean, at all. And why I ever thought it would be cool to be a climber, I can't really even tell you. I just used to enjoy being out in the woods and going camping in local woodlots. And then I started reading these mountaineering books, and I thought, this is like the coolest thing in the world. It's, you know, when you're a young adolescent, it's like total adventure. But the problem was, I mean, the closest I could get to climbing in around Mamaroneck or Scarsdale, New York, was like a guy who had a merit badge for rappelling.
Right.
And that was it. And there aren't any climbing walls. There aren't any, It really wasn't until I got to college up in Vermont where there was an outing club where I had the first opportunity to go. The first weekend of school up there, I went on an outing club adventure and learned how to belay and how to climb in a pair of Fabiano mountain boots. And next weekend in the Gunks, and that was pretty much it.
That's pretty cool, actually, because that's like a little bit of a parallel to my story in terms of, being sort of an outdoorsy kid. Although my family was sort of out, or at least in the past had been, my folks were both farm kids and stuff, but we lived in the burbs, and when you just said like camping in woodlots, like I was the same way. Like if there was an acre of woods that I could sort of find or whatever, I would go out and hang out. And
would your folks take you out? Like, did you ever go camping with them? Did you ever take them out, like to a state park or?
Yeah, we went camping a few times, but it wasn't like a total thing that we did all the time. But yeah, and then I went to college and started climbing. But so that's kind of just sort of interesting that. A decade and a half apart, or no, just about 13 or 14 years apart, actually. So how old were you when you started? You were up in college.
I was 18.
Okay.
Yeah,
huh.
I was 18. And I was I guess by today's standards, a very late start, because by 18, you've got to be climbing like 15B or so by now to even be considered a punter.
Right, exactly. Well, that's definitely modern, There was I was just talking to Randy about that, like, it wasn't like Kids at the Crag back in the day.
No.
It was an adult activity for the most part, although he was pretty young when he started. But right, so yeah, you end up in upstate, like towards, what did you say, Vermont?
I was up in Burlington,
okay.
UVM, yep. And there were, luckily, up there were definitely people who climbed. It was, and the other big difference then, too, is the difference between, if you're looking at starting out now, I would hasten to say most people who have started climbing now probably went to a birthday party at a gym, and they were exposed to the idea of climbing from that.
Sure.
But then, of course, if you weren't already an outdoors person of some sort, you weren't going to have any exposure to rock climbing. It was about being outside. It was much more of a, much more of an outdoor, almost environmental ethic kind of thing you did.
Sure.
Just a lot more challenging than hiking down a trail, but and a lot more exciting because, of course, the gear was always, there's no sport climbing. You had to put the gear in. So that was a big difference, but it was there were people in Vermont, and as soon as I was exposed to it, that was that. Done. Going every weekend. GPA fell like a rock.
Did you graduate?
I did, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
very well done.
I did that. I barely got out of there with a 3.0, but yeah. I got out.
That's funny. I mean, I lived on the outdoor adventure floor at CSU, which I believe I've mentioned before on the show, and we all were. Not all of us were climbers, but a lot of us were climbers. And at the semester, they got us all together and, basically said, listen, you guys are making us look bad. Because they had created this program where they put all these outdoor people on the same floor so we could all, thought it would be good for us spiritually. But really, it was like we had a cumulative 1.2 average or something.
And you managed to stay in school. Yeah. You must have done something right.
I actually was holding up my end because I had some pressure from above. The parental units were
perform or out.
Yeah, exactly, or pay for it yourself.
Right.
So I had sort of a scholarship program of sorts through my father. But yeah, so it's pretty funny because they're like, well, it'll help these kids adjust to college. And basically, half of them are gone at semester.
They'll adjust all right, just not the way you think they're going to adjust.
Yeah, totally. So what did climbing look like then? You just mentioned sort of the gear thing, and we're not talking again. We're not going all the way back to just purely, 8 climbing days. I mean, this was sort of free climbing was, coming on through the 70s and what did it look like to you guys?
Well, I was really fortunate. I truly believe in a lot of, I was so fortunate to grow up climbing or start climbing in the Gunks during an era where the place was truly on the map. And I've discovered that, back in the late 70s and right into the early 80s, you had every climber of note didn't matter from California, from Europe, they were coming through here. The Gunks was on the map. It's where you stopped. You stopped in the Gunks. You went to Boulder. You went to Yosemite. So, and the standards were incredibly high. If you looked at in 1973 to 74, between John Stannard, Steve Wunsch, John Bragg, and Henry Barber to a degree, they took all these aid routes that had been done in these short cliffs and turned them into what would become. No one knew what the grades were. They graded them all 510 plus. But in fact, they were as hard as 12C and some of them without very good protection. So for the early 70s, you had this. None of us knew how hard these routes really were, even though it's a few years later, right?
Right.
But you just know, they'll have these reputations like, oh, that one, right? Yeah, I don't know how they got up that one. So it was a great place to push, and there was never any question. You had gear. All you had was gear. There was, I think, everybody you've had who started climbing in the 70s said the same thing. There wasn't sport climbing, or you just went climbing. And rock climbing meant putting your gear in and doing that stuff.
Right.
And it wouldn't be until really another, really 6, 7, 8 years later before sport climbing would really start in Europe and then eventually make its way to North America.
So were you, you mentioned some of those names from the 70s. Were those guys still around? Like, did you end up, rubbing elbows with these guys, or had they moved on by the time you were really climbing a ton?
No, they were still around. Every one of them. Henry was still around.
Well, he's still around.
He's still around. Yes. Yeah. And John Stannard, he's a physicist. He worked down in Washington D.C. And he would drive up to the Gunks every weekend. And I remember I was probably about 1978, so maybe 79. I'd been coming for a couple of years to have done some harder routes, at least by the standard of the day. And I remember the first time I went climbing with John Stannard, and I was going with another friend of mine, Rich. John said, "Hey, would you like to go climbing the next day?" John was a very, very quiet guy. He didn't say a lot. And I just said, "Would you like to go climbing tomorrow?" And we were like, "Yeah, we'd love to go climbing with you." And I remember that night being so nervous. We were like, "Oh my God, we're going climbing with God tomorrow." Oh my God, what are we going to do? And we ended up just having this. It was really kind of a funny day. We went out and went climbing with him, and during the entire day, I doubt we shared 10 words. Just went out and did pitches of climbing.
Really?
And then that was it. Uh-huh. And I had a few more adventures with John. I just realized he's just a very, very quiet man who did his thing. Probably of the people of that era, the one I climbed the most with, and was still quite active, was John Bragg. Because John was still climbing and still putting up routes in the late 70s of note.
Right. And John Bragg, he's like Patagonia, is that
First Ascent of Torre Yeager with Jim Donini.
Right, okay. Yeah. Awesome, yeah, of course. So this show has always been very Colorado-centric because that just happens to be where I live.
Convenient.
And earlier you just mentioned, and by the way, Eastern listeners, look, here he is, Russ Clune. Russ Clune is sitting here.
And still living in the East. Probably unlike
so there you go. Yeah, he didn't move away. Like, I think John lives in Colorado, doesn't he?
Yeah,
exactly. So
the smart people left a long time ago.
But and then you just mentioned, looking at the history of particularly free climbing, because it was something that could be done in a notable way off of a big wall. You did have, reading the histories, it was, the Gunks and Boulder and Yosemite.
Yep.
But at the same time, even back then, there was it feels like the history, even now looking back, it was very Western centric. Was that something you guys were aware of?
Or for sure.
Felt like there was a huge rivalry, or you had to sort of, touch toes with these guys out west, or that sort of thing?
Well, of course you had to. And if you look at, Steve Wunsch did a huge amount of climbing out in the Boulder area. Mm-hmm. A bunch of first.
Right.
But he was also, back east all the time as well. And yes, we always felt like the little kid or the bastard child because we were back in the East. And, the place was Yosemite. That's where everybody measured themselves. The interesting thing was virtually every Gunks climber went to Yosemite. People thought, Gunks climbers can't climb cracks. Well, in fact, we could. It wasn't that big a deal. And you go to Yosemite and realize, man, the routes back home are a hell of a lot harder than these. So, you kind of went back and whatever, dude.
Well, historically, kind of what you said about not knowing how hard these routes were and things got graded, 10 plus or whatever. And what people have to realize is that whole grading system wasn't necessarily, it's not even standardized yet. I mean, it's definitely a very subjective thing, but it was nowhere near any sort of standardized idea of grades. I mean, were you guys, well, not you, but in the early 70s, were they even using the Yosemite decimal system out there?
We used to use rocks and sticks and carve things into the ground saying, hard. No, it's a little bit in the British system. We didn't hard, very severe, hard, very severe, tough is,
Yeah.
But the idea still, it wasn't that far away from the idea that Yosemite decimal system was to stop at 5.9, and that was as hard as it got. And obviously, so just nobody really knew.
Right.
And I mean, by today's standards, it's a scientific methodology compared to then. But it gave you an idea. Right.
But what I guess I want to get at, it seems like historically, since then, we get these stories about how all of a sudden, we realize that route that was 10 plus is actually, guess what? It's like 12B, and it was a 12B before 12B existed anywhere else. I mean, isn't the Gunks known for having a couple wink, wink, nod, nod, this was here way before
for sure.
the official, first whatever.
Well, like we were talking about before, it's really hard. It's really hard to garner a complete catalog of what was going on, and because things were going on all over the world. Some of the things going on in Dresden nobody knew about. Henry went over there in 74 or 5, and he said, "Oh, this stuff's kind of hard. Plus, it's scary as hell."
Right.
But the things what it did draw, if you took that period it really was 73 to 74 with the culmination of Steve doing Super Crack, those routes turned out to be a lot harder than that they probably would have imagined. They just knew they were hard. And, and it took it just like, we don't really know truly what 515A, B, and C is about. Well, if you look at a bunch of things that were rated 13C and D when sport climbing first really started getting a foothold, now those things are all like, 14A, 14B.
Right.
You get, that's just part of the progression. I don't think people mean to undergrade or overgrade, but as it should be, you're conservative, right? You want to just not chuck something out there that seems so ridiculous. And besides putting your ego at stake, you might be just misleading. So fair enough. It's just how it goes. But the Gunks did, it's fair to say, it certainly had one of the hardest collections of free climb routes in the world.
Right.
For that,
that
totally.
Period. And again, I think there was this legacy, that started with mountain climbing per se. Then, like the way they talk about how bouldering was just training for the big climbs. And, last night in the Valley Uprising movie, when they were talking about climbing like at Stony Point or whatever, they were climbing for the big routes. They were climbing small routes for the big routes. But finally, there was like an era where, if the small routes were super hard, they suddenly became just as significant as, these great big routes. I mean, cragging kind of came into vogue in the 70s, whether it was in Eldo where, 2 or 3 pitch climb was valid, all the way down to, a place like the Gunks where a lot of stuff is 1 pitch climbs.
Yeah, and if you look at it even further, it's a matter of convenience, right? Like when you have a certain amount of free time, you can go and do so much. And it's totally valid. And if you want to even drill it down further, the popularity of bouldering takes it to its essence in a way.
Sure.
You're just going to, screw the easy moves. Let's just find the hardest, 5 meters or less and go for it.
And you don't have to ramble up to the crux.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, you mentioned like what was going on in Dresden, and you also mentioned sort of the being around for the kind of the advent of sport climbing. Not in the Gunks because it's really never taken hold there.
They really never caught on. No.
Well, that's fine. I think
it's a good thing. It's fine.
Yeah, when you have a limited resource, like to just start spraying bolts into it isn't necessarily the best idea. But nevertheless, like you were there on that cusp. You joked before we started the show that because I made a joke about your Lycra because I've seen some awesome photos of you in Lycra. But you were like, well, I also wore painter pants because that was the thing in the 70s was nice free flowing painter pants.
Oh, for sure.
And but anyway, so you were there for this transition. So tell me about your climbing. You started out as a trad climber because that was just climbing.
Right.
And you were in the Gunks, so that happened. So when did this kind of sport climbing thing sort of come on your radar? Because I think you were sort of one of the first, not first person, but you were among that first wave of people to embrace it. Yeah,
I got really lucky, right? So back in, I think it was 1980, Kim Kerrigan, who was this, very, very well-known and very accomplished and a hell of a good climber from Australia. He was in the Gunks with a couple of other folks. Alex Lowe was visiting the same time and a couple of Brits, Dougie Hall. Anyway, they're ripping the place apart. And I remember climbing with Kim as much as I could. And, one thing Kim said to me was, if you want to be the best climber you can be, get out and climb as many different routes, different kinds of rock as you can, and sample it all. And it's going to just make you a way better climber. Mm-hmm. And I really took that to heart. I really said, okay, I'm out. I just got the travel bug in a big way. So the first year we went climbing overseas, I went with my girlfriend to Europe in 81. And we started in Britain because Britain was the only place that had rock climbing comparable to the U.S. Like, there was the whole continent, but there was no real rock climbing that anybody raved about. It was the Verdun Gorge people go to. But anyway, we climbed a bunch in Britain and made our way onto the continent. And so for some reason or another, I can't remember why, but the first place we ended up was a place called the Pfalz in Germany, the Rhineland Pfalz. So this is like a big sandstone area, which would be kind of like almost a Red River Gorge-ish kind of climbing. The climbing, that's kind of a place that was having a bolt war at the time. There was, they had these bolts in, and the old trad guys were ripping the bolts out, and some were putting the bolts in. But the thing that really I found interesting, I went to this crag one day, and there's like 5 or 6 climbers who are basically on a Jumar with their harness, and they're just basically working routes on this in this system. And I was like, well, what the hell is that?
Like mini traction stuff.
Well, it'd be mini traction now, but
right.
At this time, you got to remember as well. Part of how we climbed was that if you fell off the rock, you went back to the ground. You didn't hang dogging was the same as basically, I don't know, robbery. It just wasn't fair.
Sure,
it just didn't do it. It's just cheating.
Just in case, because this is so long ago. Just kidding. But hang dogging, we hardly even use that term anymore because it's not even something you think about. But that simply means like hanging on the rope, resting, and then trying those moves again after you've fallen off.
Right. Hang dogs, being called a hang dog is a real pejorative.
But I forgot to even frame that. The way you guys were climbing was like, this weird sense of purity that in some ways, I mean, if we wanted to talk about yo-yoing, it was actually really strangely unpure.
Of course.
But yeah, so you guys weren't necessarily ever hanging on the rope and working routes, and you walk into this place and these guys are.
Yeah, they're hanging on ropes and they're working these routes, and you weren't even supposed to check out the holes beforehand. It was ground up. If you fell, you came back to the ground, whatever. But anyway, I was like, well, I wasn't really caring about what the rules were or not. I was not this complete some prophet of purism has to happen this way. I was like, okay, you're in Rome, do what's going on here. So
yeah.
But what I found interesting was the first 512 I did was in 1980, and it was this big 20-foot roof called Kansas City, route of John Bragg's, and I think it took me like 5 or 6 days to finally do this route. It's by yo-yo style. I finally did it, and I was like totally psyched because it was hard at the time. And then I'm on a route of the same grade now, and I'm checking it out this way by hang dogging and checking out a top rope and then going for the lead. And it took like 3 hours.
Right.
And I'm like, huh. What an idiot I've been. But so it really was an eye-opening thing. It's like, I tell you right then, though, I said, whoa, if this is not if what the sport's going to embrace is going to be pure difficulty, there's no doubt this is the route to pure difficulty. But
right.
That wasn't what the sport was all about then. That whole idea of keeping your wits about you, placing protection, being able to run it out, it was still, that was a big part of it.
So in other words, like pure difficulty is what, sport climbing really focuses on. And what you're saying is that there was all these other things that were as important or nearly as important as difficulty or style. It was. And it's kind of funny because really for a while that was it. It was all about the difficulty. And still, when we talk about it, we're really impressed by people who climb, any, hard 514, 515. That's a big number. But it's kind of funny to see some of the modern climbers, or maybe they're getting to be more middle-aged climbers at this point. But you look at it like, Sonny and Tommy and some other folks that are doing stuff that is, back bringing that element of danger or at least of risk back into the sport. And there's something to be said for that. Believe me, I don't want to ever risk my life again rock climbing. Right.
I'm too old to die young, as I've said before. So it's I'm not going to start now.
Right. Yeah. So all right. So this is this epiphany to you, but certainly it's not like you could just walk back to the Gunks and without derision just start doing that, or were you able to?
No way. Oh no. And again, this is part of it. I went back and I just went back to climbing the way I did, but
it was in your head.
It was in my head for sure. But believe me, it wasn't yet a done deal in Europe. That same trip in '81, we took a trip to a crag that was really known by very few people called Bukes. And Bukes at the time had no true sport routes. And I ran into Ron Fawcett there, a British climber of note at the time, probably the best British climber was around, and he was there with his wife Jill.
Right.
And I climbed probably the hardest routes at Bukes with Ron. They were maybe 12A, 12B were as hard as it got, but they were routes you put gear in and you clipped the odd piece of fixed gear and all the rest. And I would be back in Bukes a few years later, and I was like, what the hell happened to this place? All of a sudden there's people climbing on, there's all over the place. There's bolts everywhere, and people are climbing really hard shit that I had not a chance of doing.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, it just skyrocketed. So that what I'd seen in 1981, really like by 4 years later, had just happened.
Right.
And, if you remember that time, anybody who's around there was a crisis of conscience in the U.S. in the North American climbing scene, and then all of a sudden, all the bolt wars you heard about, and people wanted to support climbers, wanted to trad climb, and the Keepers of the Flame, and the fist fights between Becker and all the things that happened were all happening because really it's just a tremendous sea change in the world of climbing, and no one was willing to cede ground.
Right.
But it eventually worked out,
Yeah.
And Lycra was just a side note to that. By the way, do you know how Lycra ever came about in the U.S. climbing community?
No, but
do you want to know?
yes, of course.
So there was a climber named Mike Law, another Australian.
Sure. I've actually met Mike.
Oh, good.
A long time ago. Yeah.
Well, Mike is
Claw.
He's the Claw.
Yeah.
He's quite a character. And when I was down in Australia in '83, it was very much of a big punk scene in Arapalis. Everybody had their hair dyed and they were wearing weird clothing. And really, during that year, I think it was later in '83, Mike came to visit the U.S. He had this trip that ended up in the Gunks. And Mike started wearing, and he would go and buy these weird fabrics. Now, at the time, people were wearing things like tracksuit bottoms, and also Hind had some Lycra running clothes. So Lycra was making its way in. Long story short, Mike started making a bunch of Lycra clothing, and this guy, Hugh Herr, who was a very, very talented climber who had lost his legs on Mount Washington, really just clung on to the Claw and thought this guy was the coolest thing. And pretty soon, Huey was sewing his own Lycra clothes, and he was selling them to everybody. And he called them her clothes, and I think he said, "Get into her pants." That was his tagline. So, and
That's awesome. That's like been lost to history.
Well, not anymore.
Awesome.
Maybe it should have been for sure, but
Right.
Because Huey now is he's like one of the world's leading inventors of new prosthetics, where he has his own lab at MIT, but. Anyway, yeah, that was his business. That was his startup.
And so he brought him over.
Claw really kind of started it, and then
Right.
it just exploded. I mean, all of a sudden, all these folks were starting these little garage businesses making these things, and as soon as it caught on with the bigger companies, like when Patagonia started making some Lycra stuff, not of course in those crazy fabric or crazy patterns, but it went away. Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah, it is pretty gnarly. But yeah, if anybody out there doesn't know what the hell we're talking about, get some back issues from like 85. Get some climbing back issues from like 85, 86.
You have to be at least 18
yeah,
to
exactly.
buy those things now.
Yeah, it's a lot. They're very revealing. That's really, I think that's really the part where it was a little bit shocking. It's like,
awful.
All right.
Yeah, awful.
Okay, so back to this whole thing. So you saw this stuff going on in the bolts going into
Right.
Bukes. And also around this time, I mean, weren't you involved in the earliest like permutation of competition climbing in some way, or was that a little bit later?
Well, the first official climbing competition was in Barnanecchia in 1985. And in that year, I was over in I'd spending a good deal of time in Europe, and I was climbing a bunch with Wolfgang Gulick. And we had both been invited down to participate in this competition. Now, the idea of we are used to the ideas of comps right now, but up to that time, what you would basically have are these gatherings. Like one alpine club would invite another country's alpine club to come to this meet, and you do these routes together. And they were kind of competitions, but not like full-on competitions.
Right.
Climbing's always competitive, but this was the first one where they created these routes on these rock walls in this beautiful valley, Barnanecchia. And anyway, Wolfgang and I go down thinking it's going to be kind of a cool thing. It's going to be kind of fun.
Well, let me ask you this real quick before you get off on that story. But so when you say they created them, they were on natural rock?
Yeah, and they chipped the roots to make these roots, which at the time, if people chipped, they didn't talk about chipping. But This is this valley where these things were just created. Right. So there was a bit of, for me, I was like, whoa, this is kind of rad. This is not cool. Whatever, sport climbing, but like chipping these, on these beautiful walls, these roots for this competition seemed like crazy. But anyway, it had happened.
Right.
So
I guess there's like probably a feeling of like, well, we have so much rock.
And they do.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it.
Anyhow, so you guys go down there.
We go down there, and we don't have to do any of the qualifiers. We're naturally in the finals for the end of this thing, but we're hanging around watching this thing, and the vibe was really poisonous. It was there was a bunch of people we knew down there, and no one was talking to anybody. It was just like this very, very serious thing. And Wolfgang and I both thought, man, this is kind of jingus. This is just not that much fun at all. We ended up, Jerry Moffat was down there as well. He joined up to hang out. This is when his elbows were bunked, so he wasn't climbing in it. Otherwise, he would have been one of the invitees for sure. But they decided to make Jerry a judge, which Wolfgang I found hilarious to think of Jerry as judging this thing, but he was there anyway. So the night before the finals, and Wolfgang had watched this entire thing, they invited me and Wolfgang and Jerry to do this press conference because look, I'm the only American there, so they want some kind of I'm the token American who's at this thing. And so they asked us, so what do you think? Now you got to understand, they're asking Italian. We're speaking back in English, and there's a bunch of different countries, and it's all getting translated around. And Wolfgang and I both gave the impression that we weren't that psyched about it. We thought it was kind of not really in the spirit of climbing and blah, blah, blah. And pretty soon we're just, people are yelling at us, like we're somehow not with it and, don't understand where the sport's going. And, why are you even here if you don't think the competition's good? And it kind of got really weird. And to the point where it was so uncomfortable, Jerry grabbed the microphone and said, "Let me sing you a little song." And he was completely wasted. And he just started, drunkenly singing, and the whole thing settled down. We just left. Right. And that night, Wolfgang got completely wasted, and I got pretty drunk too. And needless to say, we did not perform all that well in the competition. Right. As it turned out. But probably the funniest part of the whole thing. This is when Stefan Glovich, he won the competition that year, and he was, and rightfully so. He looked great during the whole thing. But after we hung out for the awards ceremony, and at some point, my name gets called out, and Wolfgang looks at us. "What in the world could you have possibly won? I think you came in 40th. I have no idea." So I go up there, and I get this big trophy, right? And it's in a swag bag full of stuff. And we're like, what the fuck is this thing for? And it turns out who came the longest distance to be in the competition. Right? Well done. It's like, yeah, man, I got a trophy. We go back to back to the Franken year after that comp. And, the trophy's sitting there on Wolfgang's coffee table, and we're just looking at this thing. And finally, Kurt Albert, who's another great German climber, he's a roommate of Wolfgang's as well. He pulls off the plate, and he takes one of those little wood burner things, and he carves into the base of the statue Team Motivation, which is what we had named ourselves, just because we were so unmotivated. We took that trophy, and we actually bolted it onto a new route in the Franken year, which became known as Team Motivation.
Really?
Yeah.
Is it still there?
No, because actually another route went up next to it and the trophy disappeared.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I wonder where that trophy is.
That's a damn good question.
I've got German listeners.
Well, who knows? Anybody knows where the trophy to Team Motivation is? I want it returned.
Yeah,
that's my trophy, damn it.
It's probably in some vault somewhere. German listeners.
Team Motivation, please. I want it back. I miss it. Wolfgang we had this big talk on the way back up because we had a whole drive through the night to get back to Germany. And Wolfgang was so bummed out by the competition. He truly had been, he was so mad that this thing went on. And it wasn't because of his performance. He didn't really give a damn about that. What he really didn't like was that climbing for him is a spiritual thing, right? It's just he has fun with his friends, and it didn't really matter. I mean, of course, that guy obviously left a legacy that anyone would love to have. But it wasn't always just about the route. It was often about having a good time, about being with your friends, about the camaraderie that naturally came from how we all started climbing. Mm-hmm. And he just saw this just being the decimation of everything that was sacred to the sport. And and to a degree, I saw that too. But I also saw the sponsors there, and I saw the people there, and I saw there was 10,000 people who came to watch this thing. And I said, "When this, like it or not, I mean." This is going to happen. Right. But my big thing is, where are they going to hold these comps, though? They can't just keep on chipping
new routes, yeah.
And I think, I think it was the next year at Arco the next year was the Arco would become the Arco Masters. That was, the next year was the first thing, and then the Arco Masters became after that. And they chipped routes that next year, but I think the second year they did the Arco in 87, I think was when they had artificial walls. And after that, of course, who cares? Right. It's artificial wall, you do what you want. What you want.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty wild that they thought, okay, we'll chip these routes.
Yeah,
and we'll just keep doing this somehow. But yeah, someone was like, "Wait a second, what if we do this instead?"
I see an opportunity.
Right? Yeah, and then the first artificial walls appeared.
Yeah.
So, as a little bit of an aside, because you might have some insight into this. What do you think it is, having spent a lot of time in Europe, as to why you were right? The sport, the competition thing, really became this huge thing in Europe, but it's never really been all that big a deal in the United States. And, it sort of ebbs and flows a little bit, but I just always feel like it's not, well, I know, we know that it's not what it is in Europe in terms of crowds, in terms of participation, to the point where, it's not just about that there's more climbers there. It doesn't seem like. It seems like there's something in the interest level or the psyche. Do you have ever thought about that, or what didn't happen?
I think there's two really big differences. One was that the European culture in general is a focused on the outside and mountaineering culture. Mm-hmm. So even if you're not very passionate about it, the odds are pretty good that you've been around climbing and outside and you're aware of what it is. Now, pretty much outside of the Rockies, the Sierras, and maybe some places in the East, it's a vast no stone zone. It's stillness. Mm-hmm. People in the Midwest, I mean, they only know about climbing now because it's exposed through media. It's exposed through climbing gyms. And the other thing that's big is a lot of the European countries support it.
Right.
The clubs support climbers getting into it. There's big programs to do that that are supported by the government. So
sure, yeah. Cody Roth mentioned that too when we were talking about his stint in Austria.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean that the state supports these outing club, like these alpine clubs and these sorts of things. So
right. Just imagine if you were like, didn't have to be a professional climber, but you had some talent. It would be like being in some kind of like minor league baseball team or whatever. Sure. So you could get something out of it. So I think the idea of it being supported monetarily much more, and the fact that the exposure level is so much higher makes it interesting. But at the same time, if you think about it, even though it's not you're never going to. Well, who knows? Maybe someday it's on major network TV. It was. Snowbird was, actually. Right. That was Wide World of Sports. So we started high.
Were you at Snowbird?
I was.
Oh, right, huh?
I actually predicted Ed Langer to win it as well.
Well, nice. Did you win any money on it?
No. I was in France before that competition. I had a phone call. I called back to California for messages, and somebody from the production company for that event was asking for me to go down for an interview to do the MC stuff that Dan Goodwin would end up doing. Right. And by the way, Dan was a better choice for sure.
And as an aside, this is on YouTube. So if you guys want to watch this, because I know it is, the 88 Snowbird
1988,
comp. Yeah,
exactly.
It was like the zenith for American competition climbing because it was on NBC.
Yeah.
The Wide World of Sports, right?
It might be ABC.
ABC, whatever it was, network. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about. So you can YouTube that. Maybe I'll link it on the.
You should, especially Dan taking
the giant whipper.
It's worth it.
Yeah. So anyway, they interviewed you to be the MC or whatever.
So when you do those little screen tests, they do the question and answer, and like, so what do you think, Russ? Who's going to pull it out of their ass and win this thing? And I said, and because I was friends with Patrick, and I knew a bunch of the French climbers as well, but actually a bunch of the climbers in this thing altogether. And I said, look at right now, the way that Patrick thinks and the way that guy goes to competitions or not, if he's not fit and he doesn't think he's going to win, he ain't going to show up. And I know he's climbing really well right now. He's just over in France, and I put my money on him. And then, when he won it, I remember seeing the producer there, and she looked at me. I said, "Told you."
Yeah, totally. No, it's storied because not only did he win, he was the only guy to top the wall out. He was the last competitor, if
Absolutely.
I remember right.
Yep, he was.
Yeah, and so even with all that drama, like that was the last time they put sport climbing on television.
It's true, and it really was amazing. I mean, you couldn't have made it better for Hollywood.
Sure.
I can't. Whether he was the last climber or not, he was the last climber anybody remembers.
Right,
that's for sure.
I'm pretty sure he might have been the last, at least in the finals, kind of thing.
Yeah,
might have been the last guy to go,
and he topped it out.
Yeah,
and he did so with style, and it was great.
That's pretty awesome, actually. I forgot that you were there. Although you had told me that before, so that's pretty cool.
It was fun to see.
Well, let me ask, I mean, one of the things I love about these stories that you told about hanging out in Europe and Wolfgang and all these guys, and I always feel like, I don't know, in modern times, because of the state support and like the celebrity that you can get out of climbing in Europe, that, I think we feel like, and this is probably mythology, but we feel like, the dirtbag climber is this like quintessentially American sort of thing, or this like partying dirtbag kind of climber. And your stories, I know Wolfgang went on to be very famous and to probably make a fair amount of money before he passed in climbing and everything else. But your stories just always make me think about these guys as the same way, just like living to climb and trying to make it work and sleeping on people's floors and cruising around and all those guys that that became such storied names started out that way. Anyhow,
they really did, and that's is probably still the case for most climbers today. I mean, so a few very selected climbers truly make what would be called a good living from climbing. There's not a lot. I mean, percentage-wise, it's probably the same as it was then. Or, tell you the truth, I even Wolfgang, when you look at the mid '80s, he wasn't making a ton of money climbing.
Right.
He made money by doing some slideshows. He got some sponsorship, a little bit of gear, but not a lot. And if you want to think about dirtbag, my God, the Brits put any Americans to shame.
Yeah,
those
right.
guys are living on the dole.
Living on the dole, yeah.
Hunter House Road with Jerry and Chris Gore and Andy Pollitt and Martin Atkinson. Those guys were just living. You're all in the dole and making, getting like $35 a month and a free house, and
Right.
it didn't get any more dirtbag than that.
yeah, totally. And yet they were the top of the sport.
Absolutely.
And that's like another like really awesome thing that, and it's changed a bit, but again, like there's a lot of these top climbers that, I mean, what were they even eating? Like, how could their nutrition been like anything but just like the worst? And plus, they were total party animals as well,
I don't think they partied quite as much. I mean, there was partying for sure. But still, they were pretty good at saving money. Matter of fact, a lot of them would save up their money just so they could take a trip away from Britain, and somehow, squirreling away some money on the equivalent of about $50 a month.
Right.
Being able to do so, that is truly a talent.
Mm-hmm.
And yes,
Yeah.
they end up in California. Like, how'd you get here?
Right.
Well, I hitched a ride.
Yeah. Well, that still goes on too. Actually, it's amazing to me the whole climber thing. What everybody will go through to be climbers is still awesome. Like, I think any normal person would just be like blown away by what we consider completely normal.
Yeah. No doubt.
Yeah. So I mean, I was actually, speaking of being at OR, was here with a friend and met a Sports Illustrated reporter who, used to doing football and all this sort of stuff. And he was here this was quite a while ago, but he was here to interview Chris Sharma for SI Kids, when he was a lot younger. And, he was sitting there telling me about how he'd met somebody who he told me he lived in a tent, and just because this guy had no idea what climbing. He's like, yeah, I lived in a tent for 2 years and just, lived on nothing and blah, 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 and was so blown away. And I was just like, do you want to meet more people like that? Because, within about 10 yards, because we were standing in the climbing section over there.
Right.
I'm like, I can find some more people that have gone a lot longer than 2 years, in their tent, and they're like the top of the sport,
You think that's interesting?
Yeah.
Let me introduce you to this guy.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go find Chongo. No, he's not here, but yeah, I mean, he was just he couldn't believe it.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, so what? He had a tent. That was good.
Yeah, better than most.
Better than he was living in the boulders in Yosemite or whatever, So it was just funny. It made me realize that nobody out there knows what the people go through to be climbers. So.
No, but in the end, it really was a time where there was very little professionalism as we think of it now, and most climbers were dirtbags of some sort, of some ilk or another. I mean, the only guy I can really think of that was truly making a great living when he got into kind of the mid-late 80s was Patrick.
Right,
he really was he was making money, and he had some big contracts.
Sure, yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your career. So you're over there for quite a few years. I mean, were you just traveling back and forth?
I principally spent, after college, about the next 6 years full-time climbing, as much as I could. My parents were good enough to let me live at the house. I could get a decent job for a few months, and I would work anything from a few months to maybe half a year, and I'd take off and go someplace. And I spent most of that time going overseas, a ton of trips to Europe, to Japan, to Korea, to Australia, to, just any place that had climbing that was worth doing or I'd heard about. And a lot of those trips came about just, there was, again, no internet. So it was just doing some research, finding out from a friend, you got to go check out this place. So these were just trips that came about by happenstance.
Sure.
I mean, the place you had to go, but there's tons of places. Once you've been to Europe about 10 times, it's time to go check out someplace else.
Right, absolutely.
But there were great trips. I tried to mix it up. going to Eastern Europe when it was the Iron Curtain. When going back to American, there was my first trip there was to Czechoslovakia, and I was supposed to meet some British friends there. I never found them. I ended up my first route there was a completely petrifying, unaware that I did a first free ascent of some 12A on 3 bolts over 3 of those big ring bolts with a course of 120 feet. Petrifying. But it ended up being a great trip, and I had no idea when I was there. I met these great Czech climbers and had a great time, but it was like all the good stories. It just kind of happened. It happened by accident. But I remember after having this great trip, being there for 2 weeks and just meeting all these people and having this great trip on the way out of Czechoslovakia, I had no idea, but I'd overstayed my visa by a week. And the border guards on the train out, I'm just like, they'd come on the train, they're checking my visa, and this guy's just like looking at me, he starts yelling, and he's just, this guy's got a uniform and he's got his machine gun over his shoulder, and he's like, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, I don't speak any Czech. I'm like, what the hell is he on about? And he's pointing at my thing. He's pointing at my visa instead, and then going this. I look and I see 7, and then I see the one word I did learn was day, which is den. 7 den. Ooh, I've been here for like 14 den.
Right.
No bueno.
Right.
And then so the cop comes on. They both kind of looked at me, and it's like, what are they going to do?
Right.
I mean, so they just threw my passport back because I was just at the border. Like, get the hell out of here.
Right.
So those kinds of things happen then, which never happen now. But but they made these trips exciting. And also, I took virtually every trip I took solo, because who else is going to be able to take off 6 months from whatever they're doing and go someplace? And I really loved that because it always immersed me. You had no choice. You immersed yourself in the culture. You couldn't be in any bubble. There's no friend to be with that could kind of take you off. So you really got involved with the local climbing scene. And it was a smaller tribe, right? So everybody wanted to hang out anyway, but you had to be part of it. You couldn't be away from it.
Now, did you go to Eastern Germany as well?
I did
beforehand, or before it was split, reunited, or
yes,
reunified, or whatever. So, I mean, when you would do this, you had to have been, in terms of climbing, but not just climbing, but in general, like kind of an alien. I mean, for an American to show up in a place like that to climb must have been just like some sort of person walking in from Mars.
Not many people did it. I mean, Czechoslovakia was really weird because, definitely that was even weirder than East Germany in some ways. Because when I did go to East Germany, it was with Wolfgang, and he had been there a bunch. So he had connected to Bern Arnold, and we hung out, and that was almost like being on a guided tour, right, compared to just trying to figure it out in Czechoslovakia. But it was really different because you were going to. I mean, it's really hard to think of what it was like then to travel into a place that was so alien. That was the enemy. I mean, truly like the enemy. You're talking about the Cold War and this weirdness. But the people, what you realize when you got there is the people are all just people, and they're super psyched to go climbing, and they're super psyched to see you. And I never got any bad vibe for being an American in any of those places. As a matter of fact, they'd just love to know.
Well, I think that's kind of more I was getting at. I think they would be stoked, because they had to have known about places probably like Yosemite somehow. Some of them, anyway.
Oh yeah.
And so and I think a place like Czechoslovakia or something, the mythology surrounding Yosemite, which we all live with, that's so huge and continues to huge, and actually it's probably bigger now than ever. I mean, it must have been just exponentially larger to these guys climbing these, making it up as they go and climbing these little sandstone towers that they were climbing on and stuff, and just they probably were like, wow, this is a guy from there.
Just for them, the idea of America.
Right.
It was just like, whoa, that's so cool. Because, whatever. They just thought it was the neatest thing.
Those were the good old days when they thought we were awesome.
They liked us, right, right. But
common people did anyway.
A good example of that as well was in '86, I was over Todd Skinner and I decided at some point we wanted to go climb in Russia. But the only way to go climbing in the USSR was to go on, basically go to the speed climbing competition that they held every couple of years.
They're still into that, aren't they?
I don't
know. Climbing?
If they are, it's definitely worth going to. It's just ridiculous. It was really fun. But anyway, we managed to get the Alpine Club to back us. We had to have an invitation from our Alpine Club, and when Jim McCarthy was the president at the time, he said, "Yeah, I'll get you guys. We'll sign a note saying you guys are the official U.S. team and whatever." So we went over there, and the Russians were so to have the Americans come to this competition, which is generally just about Eastern European countries, and then I think Japan would show up, and West Germany would show up, but mostly it's Eastern European countries. And, you can imagine Skinner. Skinner was just larger than life no matter what. He has his cowboy hat on, right? And they're doing this interview, and they're really psyched that these Americans here, and, I'm from New York. It's like, oh, New York is... Then with Skinner, they say, so Todd, this comes to these translators, like, so Todd, where in America are you from? And he goes, Wyoming. Wyoming. Where is Wyoming? And he says, it's in the West. Oh, the West. And what do you do in Wyoming? I am a cowboy. And the crowd goes nuts. And,
So, I knew what you were going to say because I knew what, I could just imagine what he was going to lay out.
He just needed a Marlboro hanging out of his mouth and he would have become president.
Right. Because there is this weird, I've heard of this from other people that there's this weird, even in Germany to a certain extent, this fascination with the Western cowboy culture.
Totally.
That, we don't even have it.
No, we don't believe in it because we know it's bullshit.
Yeah, right. So everybody flips out over him being a cowboy.
They loved it. And Todd, he never missed a beat. And
Right.
after that, he was the celebrity for that entire competition.
Yeah,
it was hilarious.
You were like, I should have said cowboy.
Oh god, I couldn't never pulled it off.
Well,
Todd's
no.
wearing the Stetson.
Yeah,
He's got
he was a
the
cowboy.
the only thing missing with the chaps.
Right, exactly. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's good.
Totally. Did you end up climbing over there?
We did, and amazingly, we somehow or another managed to come in third place, which was astounding. No one's going to beat the Russians,
Right?
And I think the Poles came in second, but somehow, Todd and I were crafty about it. We saw, I don't even want to get into how weird the competition was, but we just followed the techniques and used the equipment in terms of lengths of rope that the Russians did, and we managed to figure out how to do well. One of these, if you can imagine a speed climbing comp, one of the things we had to do was a 4-pitch route, and we had to climb it as fast as we could. And we realized, the Russians had ropes that were exactly the length of the route, so there was never any coiling. So you just climbed this. So anyway, and anything went. You could grab on whatever you want. You had to stay within these boundaries. But we climbed this 4-pitch route as fast as we can, and we really burnt up it really fast. But they also included the rappelling time. It turned out we had the second fastest ascent time. And we had the slowest rappel time because we were like, we're not going to die.
Let's just keep it under wraps here.
Yeah.
Well, that must have been totally. I mean, again, it's hard for, I think, current generation and myself as well. I mean, I was a kid in the 80s, but you're not really as aware of the political scene when you're a kid. But, I mean, it was serious business back then. I mean, this was Reagan era, Cold War stuff that...
Yeah, Gorbachev was... I think at that point we were... I think we were into perestroika. We had gone through...
Right.
It was interesting. It was interesting.
Yeah.
There were changes.
It's cool. I mean, climbing is always... I think centered around this idea of travel, but also, I mean, it's sort of hokey or whatever, but this idea that I think I've always felt that, if there's one thing that helps is that we automatically have this thing in common. When you walk into a place and you don't speak the language and if they're climbers and you're a climber, well, then we meet eye to eye on this one thing.
Totally.
And there's been these peace climbs like on Everest and all that sort of thing that is sort of built on this, but it's more powerful on that individual level that I've found. Because I've traveled alone as well into some places, nothing like that, but it's just nice and comfortable feeling to know that, well, I know these guys feel the same way I do about this one thing,
And I'm not even so sure right now that you could get the same kind of vibe as you had then, only because climbing's become much more egalitarian in terms of the segment of population it engages. It's no longer just about somebody who had some kind of outdoor ethic experience, or if you think about all the folks that climb, it really runs a tremendous social gamut, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's all over the map. And for one reason or another, it really had nothing to do with income, but there was this kind of solid.
Is that my door?
I think somebody's trying to get in.
Yeah. No, we're good. Can I actually have a towel?
And now a word from our sponsors.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you.
That's awesome.
That happens all. It's kind of late in the day. I didn't.
Yeah. God, here.
Cool. Where were we?
I was just saying
about the flattening. Oh, yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I'm not sure you could go any place right now, and just because you're a climber with other climbers, have that same vibe. Just because there's it's such a broad social spectrum,
right?
And maybe, but you'll have something to talk about. But will you just all of a sudden be invited to the stranger's house to hang for the week? Probably not.
I don't know. I feel like it can happen still.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah.
Again, it was automatic then.
Right.
It wasn't even a thought.
Right.
If somebody shows up, oh yeah, dude. But and also, if by the time you got to two people, you had some common friend.
Right. Well, yeah, because it's interesting that you say that, because as you tell these stories without being self-conscious of it, you're just like, oh yeah, and then I was with Todd Skinner, and then I was with, and then Jerry Moffat was there, and then, and you're just like hitting all these names that are important to me because I started climbing in '89, and so as soon as I started reading the magazines, you're talking about the people who were on fire in '89, in the late '80s, and so you're just like dropping these names, but like I said, in not a self-conscious way because you were a really good climber and a really well-traveled climber, and so that's the people you were running into. It was such a small tribe, especially at that level of traveling climbers, who were climbing really hard routes.
They were your friends.
Yeah.
They were your friends. You met him.
Kim Kerrigan, too. I mean, he's a legend, in Australia. And
he was I think anybody who climbs, if you want to climb your best, you're always going to climb with the folks who are going to push you. Mm-hmm. And that's where, get out of your comfort zone. And all those guys, I mean, they were brilliant climbers, but some days they weren't brilliant climbers.
Right.
I mean, it's like anything. People have on days, off days, but more than anything else, not only were they going to push me as a climber, but they were just fun as hell to hang out with. Mm-hmm. They're just great folks. If they weren't great folks, you didn't hang out with them.
Right. Well, I'm going to I want to ask you something a little more serious, because you're still climbing. You know, how long did we decide?
37 years now.
Okay, 37 years. We, like I said, we climbed in Colombia together not too long ago. You're still traveling to climb. You were in Sicily recently as well.
Yep.
And, but looking at, one of the things, we hinted at is that, your good friend Wolfgang died. Kurt Albert's gone. A bunch of people that I probably can't even mention. But looking back at this life and all these friendships you've had and these things that these guys that aren't with us anymore, some of them died climbing, some of them didn't. What's your sort of take on a life of climbing and these experiences you had? And, you just came off this injury, this back injury and everything else. What's your take on your sort of life of climbing, that you stuck with it this long and it's still something that you're pursuing as much as you can? You were texting me and emailing me like how much it sucks that you can't climb because your back is messed up, although it seems like you're doing pretty well now.
It'll get better.
Yeah. So,
there's a couple of questions.
Can you can you sort of reflect on a life of climbing in the sense?
I think truly if you're into climbing for as long as I've been and others, you certainly get beyond the idea of just climbing for difficulty, because you are just not going to climb as hard as you want. It's all there is to it. You can do your best. But it's about the community. It's about the friendships you develop. And, I look at, in some ways, I was just the most blessed person in the world to end up climbing. I really think, anyway, that with those folks that are gone. Alex Lowe was a dear friend. I loved him. We had great trips. Skinner was a dear friend. I loved him. We had great trips. Same for Wolfgang and Kurt Albert. There's, unfortunately, and a lot of other folks that, aren't as well known, but are just as dear to my heart. I don't get overly maudlin thinking about missing them in that manner. I missed them, yes, but some of those folks died climbing, and some of them died in Wolfgang died in a car accident.
Right.
Skinner died from what, in my opinion, is just a stupid accident where he should have had a retired harness long ago. Kurt died of just having a stroke, or something happened in the middle of easy ground.
Right.
That's life. We're going to lose friends, and the good thing about the community is I feel like I continue to make new friends. I look at people that I just think of being great folks now. There's JT, there's Bag, there's Tommy Caldwell and Sonny Trotter, and a bunch of folks that are younger and just fantastic folks. And plus some of my old gang's still around.
Yeah,
Lynn's still around,
yeah.
and we're going to go kick it in rifle next week. And
are you really?
Yeah, for Wednesday and Thursday. Get together. Yeah, you should come out for sure.
Nice.
Take a day off. Watch me fall for 5'11s more.
Don't worry about that.
But those friendships continue, and I do get it from some folks saying, "God, you're so lucky because you had those experiences and they're younger climbers." But you got to understand, everybody who's a climber and is passionate about it is going to have their own story, their own passionate memories of the times they did it. And the longer you do it, the more you have those things. Mm-hmm. It's just the deeper they become. So yeah, I don't see. I still love to climb, and I can never see turning my back on climbing just because it's made me. It gave me a living. Mm-hmm. It gave me a reason for being in young formative years, and it gave me friendships that I'll have forever, and memories I'll never lose till the day I die.
Well, awesome. I think that's a perfect place to end, actually. I totally appreciate you sitting down, Russ, and These stories, I heard some more today, and I'm sure there's a bunch more I haven't heard. And building on what you just said, I feel really lucky that we've started to hang out because
Absolutely.
It was we knew each other a little bit, but that trip to Colombia, I just had the best time hanging out with you and Amy, and I'm glad we're friends now. So.
Yeah, me too, Chris. Absolutely.
Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Russ for sitting down, and also thanks to Russ for reminding us that the pillars of this sport, this passion, this thing that we love so much are indeed friendships. The friendships and the partnerships that you make, I think, are the most important thing that we have in climbing. And part of the fun of this whole thing is that I'm continuing to make friends like Russ. The Enormocast is helping out with that. This community has grown quite large. I'm still surprised when I find out people are out there listening, and I appreciate that. So thanks for listening, everybody. If you want to help out, remember that you can go to enormocast.com, click on the Help Out tab. A bunch of stuff to do to help out the podcast in terms of popularity and getting the word out there. And the most important thing is just to tell your friends. If you're digging this thing and you know some other climbers that aren't aware of it, let them know. Let them know to give it a try. All right, folks, September is halfway over. I hope you guys are getting after it out there. It is indeed one of the great months worldwide for climbing, I think, in a lot of places. The early fall is so nice. Or early spring, if you're down in the southern hemisphere. Either way, it's a good month, September. So get out there and enjoy it, and don't forget to check your knot, check your partner's knot, communicate, do everything right this September, and safely send those projects.
Come far, pilgrim.
Feels like far.
Were it worth the trouble?
What trouble?
Teachers told me that's